Hello and welcome to Need to Know, the programme that keeps you up to date on the big issues in the world of education. In this programme we look at performance management and how it affects teachers. Here to explain how it works is Mike Baker. Let's start with the basics. What is performance management and why is it important to teachers?
Well, it's a system for appraising how teachers are doing in their jobs against their job description, also looking at where they're going in the terms of their future career. So they'll all be sitting down at some point with a reviewer, either the head teacher or line manager, to discuss their aims and go through their objectives. And also there'll be classroom observation, which we'll hear more about later on. And of course there is a link to pay. It's not all about pay, but it is a link to pay, which of course makes it very important to teachers.
Put it in context. What's the history of performance management?
Well, we have to go back a decade really for that, because in 1998 the government announced the details of a new system of performance-related pay which involved a new pay threshold at the top of the basic pay scale. That teachers who wish to move across the threshold onto the extended pay scale would have to prove high and sustained levels of performance, and that this would be done through a new system of tough appraisals. Now, this was controversial because while performance-related pay was common enough in the private sector, it was treated with great suspicion in the public sector. Many felt that it was in conflict with the collegiate nature of running a school and was wrong in principle.
So 10 years on, what's happening?
Well, there's been plenty of wrangling between the government and the unions in the intervening 10 years, but the principle of performance-related pay was established. Performance management is now about something much wider than just pay, although that remains central to it. The most recent regulations determining the way the process should work were drawn up in 2006 and have been in effect from the beginning of the current school year. These regulations empower schools to implement a performance management policy. They set out the rules for the appointment of those individuals responsible for reviewing performance. They give head teachers the right to delegate the reviewers' duties in their entirety to line managers. And they provide for appeal arrangements for anyone unhappy with the process. They also allow governing bodies and education authorities to have regard to the results of their teacher reviews when exercising any discretion in relation to pay.
You used the phrase tough appraisals, and it won't just be head teachers who are carrying out these reviews.
No, that's right. I think it would probably be impossible for head teachers if they had to review everybody. So yes, they can be delegated by the head teacher to senior members, heads of department and so on. That has caused some concern. One of the unions, for example, was worried that it was a bit like being reviewed by your mate along the corridor. So that's one of those issues that remains.
So what if a teacher is unhappy about who's conducting the review?
Well, if they're unhappy and in exceptional circumstances and for professional reasons, then they can submit a written request to the head teacher for an alternative reviewer. The next stage is the planning and review meeting, which is at the heart of the process. This is the first step in the performance management cycle. The regulations make very clear that this is a collaborative process of professional dialogue between the reviewer and the member of staff. The system is designed so that both reviewer and reviewee play an active part in reviewing performance and planning future development.
Now, that's a very important detail. It's not just a question of a reviewer watching and judging what you're doing. It is an active dialogue.
It is an active dialogue, and I think it's very important because the government is very clear that this is, as you say, a dialogue between the reviewer and the reviewee. So when it comes to reviewing that last cycle, that's the performance before the review, the government suggests that teachers should reflect on their achievement in the last performance management cycle. They should identify any issues that have affected their performance positively or negatively. They should consider any issues about the planned support they needed or received, and reflect on how far they have met the agreed performance criteria. As for considering future development, the regulations suggest that teachers consider what they would like to achieve in the next cycle, identify what professional development might help them develop their practice further, and consider their professional aspirations.
That's a big agenda for one meeting.
You're right, it is a very big agenda. And of course that's not all, because the meeting should also allow the teacher and their reviewer to agree a plan. Now this will focus on priorities and areas where specific action is required, and should set out what further information and assessment is needed to complete the performance review. Now this plan forms the basis of a statement signed by both parties. The regulations suggest that the plan should include the reviewee's objectives for the cycle ahead, the arrangements for observing the reviewee's performance in the classroom set at a maximum of 3 hours, the support that will be provided to help the reviewee to meet the performance criteria, and the reviewee's training and development needs and the actions that will be taken to address them.
There's a big gap in what you said. Results. Traditionally, teachers don't like payment by results. What part do results play in all this?
They don't like it. They take them all the way back to the 19th century payment by results, which was very much hated. And there was concern right at the beginning of this that this would be all about, be driven by results. Now, of course, results can be taken into account, but there's no direct and automatic link between either good or bad results and how well you do in this review process.
And what happens at the end of this review process?
Well, at the end of the performance cycle, as it's known, the two meet again. All the evidence gathered by the reviewer is shared in advance to allow an informed discussion. The idea then is to achieve a shared understanding of the progress made towards meeting the performance criteria, to explore any issues that might have impeded the reviewee's performance, to agree an assessment of the overall performance of the reviewee agreed at the beginning of the cycle, and include a recommendation on pay progression where the reviewee is eligible for that. And it's important to stress that this process doesn't normally, on its own, affect the annual pay increment awarded to teachers, but only applies to situations where a teacher is on the pay scale for post-threshold teachers, the pay spine for members of the leadership group, or the pay spine for advanced skills teachers.
So, performance reviews, particularly when they affect pay, could be quite contentious issues. What happens if a teacher and a reviewer don't agree?
There is potential for it to be quite contentious, absolutely, because if there's no agreement, then both views on the process are recorded on paper and the issue is then referred to the head teacher for moderation. If these informal methods of discussing the matter and resolving disagreements don't work, then it's for the governing body to settle as they would other grievances.
You know, on this series, Need to Know, we've covered some very complex topics over the months, but this is a hard one to get your head around, isn't it?
I think this is by far the most complicated and in many sense terribly important to teachers from their career point of view. And fortunately, though, we have two expert voices that can help us through these issues. And first, I recently met up with Chris Keates, General Secretary of the NASUWT, and asked how she thinks the new performance management system has been working in practice.
Well, the revised regulations came in from the 1st of September 2007. We're at the moment gathering data in partnership with governments and the other partners that we work with, because of course we all agreed these revised regulations. We've got a very mixed picture. What is absolutely clear is that the big problem is that teachers still feel that despite a 3-hour limit on observation, that they're still being over-monitored.
What can be done then about classroom observation? It seems to be one of the biggest concerns. What are the guidelines? What could a teacher do if they feel that things are being exceeded?
Well, if a teacher thinks that the 3-hour limit has been exceeded, then they really need to be raising that with the head teacher. They then need to be raising that with their union. And then in addition to that, NASUWT as a social partner would raise that in the national forums we have that are actually monitoring the implementation. But it was absolutely clear that teachers feel this is a big issue for them. They feel that they're not getting developmental observation. What they're getting is monitoring.
And this also raised the interesting issue of the relationship between the teacher and, say, the head of department who may be doing the reviewing. If a teacher is not happy with that, again, what can they do? What grounds of appeal might there be, or for asking for a different reviewer?
Well, there's provision in the regulations for a teacher to ask for a different reviewer, but it would have to be in exceptional circumstances and on professional grounds. There'd have to be some professional problem with that. If a teacher had a review they weren't happy with, then what they can do, there's an appeal mechanism at every stage. And we would always advise them to take advice from NASUWT.
What for you are the key principles that ensures that performance management is about career development and rather than about some sense of more punitive monitoring or simply a link to pay?
Well, the revised regulations were brought in on the back of culture change, that we wanted this to be the catalyst for a professional dialogue between teachers and their line managers. So it should be about a proper conversation about what's going well, what needs to be enhanced, what development and training the teacher needs. I think we're quite away from that, but certainly now we've got the building blocks in place for that proper professional dialogue.
Well, that's the view from the NASUWT. Well, to look at some of those concerns and other issues, I'm joined now by a real expert on this. Susan Tratton is a head teacher and also author of a book on performance management. Susan, thank you very much for coming in. This balance between it being about career development and this fear of monitoring, how do you get that balance right?
I think it's really important to start with the policy. One of the things about the new regulations is that the governors and the head teacher have to have a policy on performance management and have to consult widely with all of the teachers in the school and the professional associations and the unions. So that's the first way in which you can make sure that there's a balance between those two things. But I think one of the things that's really interesting and exciting about the new regulations is that not only do people have to have a review of their objectives and their performance, but also in agreeing the objectives for the next stage of the cycle, people have to talk about what their training development needs are and what support they're going to need in order to achieve those objectives.
So that could all be quite positive for the teacher. But what about this particular concern about the classroom observation? I can understand why people would be wary of that.
Well, for many schools, classroom observation isn't a new thing. It's part of the general day-to-day life of the school.
It's a bit scary if it's linked to performance management and potentially therefore linked to pay, isn't it?
I suppose so. It could be seen in that way. But I think that reminds us that if you have a good classroom observation policy, if classroom observation is part of the everyday experience of a teacher, then it doesn't have to be the one that's done just before the performance review. It can be any one of those lesson observations that happens throughout the year. And of course, there are safeguards in the regulations, which means that there are only a maximum of 3 hours for lesson observation. And if there are particular concerns, then that has to be dealt with separately.
Well, we heard from the union that's one of their concerns. What are the other potential pitfalls in this whole performance management?
I think the first thing is that about the relationship between the line manager and the person who's being reviewed. It's a change in relationship for some people, and so it reminds us that people do need to be trained in order to do that, and also there has to be all the things like grievance procedures, there have to be appeals, and there has to be a moderation to make sure that what's right for what's happening in one area is the same as what's happening in another area of the school. So it's fair and equitable for everyone.
OK, and finally, fairly briefly, what about head teachers? Do they get reviewed as well?
Oh yes, head teachers have been reviewed for quite a long time, and the governors have to appoint a panel of governors who are going to review the head teacher's performance and take advice from an external advisor who's the school improvement partner.
Susan Tratton, thank you very much, and it's interesting to know that heads are also being reviewed. Thank you.
So that's how it's all going to work. Does this mean the dream of 1998 has turned into reality?
Well, I think some of it. I mean, some of the aspects that were in there initially about getting rid of teachers who weren't doing so well, that's gone. Some of the stronger links with pay have gone, but there's a lot left.
Well, that's what you need to know about performance management. You can find out much more via our website. Until next time, from Mike and from me, goodbye.